First of all, can you just explain what the meaning crisis is?
Well, the meaning crisis is a phrase that has come into use recently. I don't remember who is the inventor of the phrase, but the popularizer has been Dr. John Vervaeke, professor of cognitive science and philosopher at the University of Toronto, who has perhaps been the person who has most been speaking about the meaning crisis, and he has offered some ideas in order to, what he called meaning crisis. Now, some of those ideas, of course, are excellent. Others would be, let's say, insufficient if we are approaching it from a Christian point of view, which obviously I am. So the meaning crisis fundamentally is the fact that in our modern society, because there is no longer a firmly held belief in ultimately in reality, but perhaps before that, a firmly held belief in various elements of reality. It means that people don't know what to believe, don't have firm fixed beliefs, and therefore don't know what they are doing with their lives. They don't know what the purpose of their lives is. They become confused. They wander from one thing to another. They seek out temporary and insufficient or provisional solutions to the problem. Basically, anything that will fill the gap, fill the hole that's inside their hearts, because they don't know why they are here in this world, in this existence, and what they're supposed to do with it. So fundamentally, it is the result of skepticism and relativism, which have been increasing since we could say the end of the Middle Ages up to our present time, in which we are, the skepticism and relativism has developed to something like its ultimate point in postmodernism. And since everything is relative, since there are no absolutes, since we are just, that we live in a purposeless universe and we are just elements, not non-special elements within this purposeless universe, we don't know, there's no real meaning in life. And so according to this popular idea, which is, let's say, the dominant idea within our Western culture, people can create their own meaning for their own lives, whatever floats their boat. But the problem is that doesn't actually work. In order for there to be real meaning, there has to be a real connection to reality, which means, first of all, believing that reality exists, that we exist, and moreover, that there is a basis behind all of reality. Of course, as Christians, we would say that is God, God who created all things as an expression of his love, and he created us, human beings, to inhabit this world and to use this world in order to ascend up to God, to become closer to God, and ultimately for union with God. So this is the ultimate purpose of life, or we could say the meaning of life for us as Christians. So what has happened is that because people no longer believe in an ultimate purpose of life, or that there is an absolute foundation behind reality and behind life, because people have lost faith, in other words, not just faith in God often, but even faith in elements of reality. All sorts of problems have arisen from this. Psychological problems, depression. We find people, taking all sorts of pills in order to calm themselves down. We see people getting into harder drugs because they're looking for something more, some sort of experience. And we see on a societal basis, there's no common belief that is holding society together. So society breaks down into fragments, into groups that end up as echo chambers of themselves, that don't have anything in common with other groups. And moreover, there is no common set of beliefs that could be used as a reference point for different views to have a constructive conversation or to find a reconciliation. So there is a fragmentation of society. There is a fragmentation of the human mind. There is a fragmentation of basically all of human experience. Because, of course, to believe that, or to lack a belief in the grounding of reality, which is God, to lack a belief in the fundamental structures of reality, whatever they might be, whether it might be abstract things like universals, that there is such a thing as a human nature, for example. And you can, if you trace it, you can see where a lack of belief, or we could say a lack of faith, leads to all sorts of negative consequences. For example, if you don't believe there are universals, you don't believe that there is such a thing as a human nature. If you don't believe that there is such a thing as a human nature, and that whatever we would call human nature is just a convention of the human mind, or a convention of society, what society happens to agree on, then you can define humanity in any way that you find convenient to yourself, or any way that appeals, usually not to the best side of you, but appeals rather to the evil passions and vices within you. You end up with things like genocide against another race. Why? Because you dehumanize them, because you no longer believe that there is a common human nature. So you end up with racism, genocide, slavery, abortion is the same thing. When you have, if you don't have a firm belief in human nature, you can define humanity according to age and according to stages of development. So you can exclude from humanity those human beings who have not yet been born. So these are all practical ramifications that occur from a lack of belief in various levels of reality, and ultimately that which underlies reality. And it is causing tremendous personal crises and tremendous, increasingly, crises on a societal level.
So I imagine you'd say that God is essentially the solution to the meaning crisis?
Well, yes, although simply to have belief in God is not sufficient to solve the problem. It is perhaps the most basic element or building block of trying to get out of the meaning crisis. And the abandonment of belief in God was part of the process by which the meaning crisis was produced. But in and of itself, it's not sufficient. It has to be accompanied by all sorts of other elements. Belief in all sorts of elements of reality. I have given the example of universals and things like human nature. So yes, we have to have belief in God. It is the foundation block for everything else. But it is, in and of itself, it is insufficient.
Could you talk about some of like the ecology of practices Christianity has for dealing with the meaning crisis?
Sure. So this this phrase "ecology of practices," again, I don't know who invented it, but it's John Vervaeke who has popularized the phrase, and it's a useful phrase once it's explained what it means, because perhaps for some people it sounds like jargon. So we say ecology of practices. What we mean is a series of practices, both physical and mental, which mutually reinforce each other from different angles to help to build and express, in this particular case, build and express meaning within one's life. Again, to reference John Vervaeke here, he uses 4 categories, which I believe are very useful. Some of these have been used explicitly already by some Christian or particularly by Orthodox authors, but they are the following. So there is what can be called propositional knowledge. Then there is procedural knowledge. Then there is perspectival knowledge, and then there is participatory knowledge. And so what these levels are, specifically with reference to how we as Christians would experience them, the propositional knowledge is basically a statement of fact. It is a proposition, in other words, stating, A is B or X is Y. So for example, we can start out with the most basic proposition: God exists. All right, that's a proposition. It's something that is analyzable and understandable purely rationally. God exists, and of course that is a proposition that all Christians would defend. And then we could go on to say something like, God is Trinity. God is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, 3 persons in one essence. Again, these are propositions that all Christians believe. Jesus Christ is God incarnate. Again, another proposition. Or Jesus Christ is God and perfect man. Another proposition. Or we can, so that's on a dogmatic level. So clearly one form of proposition in a Christian context that we believe and consider to be necessary would be dogmatic statements, like the ones I just gave about God and the Trinity and Christ. Now we can put it on another level too. For example, we could put it on a moral level, and we could say, well, there's the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not commit adultery. Right? Now these are commandments. They are, but they are propositions. They fit into propositional knowledge because they're statements. They're straightforward statements, which of course we would affirm and defend. So we have to have the propositional knowledge or the propositional way of expressing our Christian life, because if we don't, then we have no clear idea of what separates us from everyone else. We have no clear idea of what we believe, and we have no, as it were, roadmap for what we should be doing and where we're going and what is the structure of reality and the universe and life and everything. So the most basic level, we could say, or the initial level on which we speak about knowledge and experiences is what can be called the propositional level. Now, it is let's say, a common theme within in modern Orthodox theology is that in the West, that is in Roman Catholicism and then in Protestantism, that the propositional element of Christianity was over-exaggerated, and that this caused, this created problems ultimately, and that the propositional element was over-exaggerated at the expense of the other parts of our Christian life. And that over-exaggeration of the propositional element then, as society became more secularized during, let's say, the scientific revolution of the 17th century, the Enlightenment of the 18th century, during the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution and the breakdown of traditional ways of living, and then in the 20th century and so forth, that this propositional element became the dominant paradigm within the Western way of viewing the world and our life in the world. And John Vervaeke calls this propositional tyranny, that knowledge in life is just about facts. And you end up with a separation, a division, a divorce of facts, or we could say propositions, from life itself, the way that we live and the way that we perceive our life in the world. So, and there's different ways that this breaks down. So, for example, there's a common juxtaposition of reason and emotion. Okay, that's something you'll commonly hear. We obviously, reason would fall more in the propositional category. Emotion would fall more in some of these other categories of participation and perspective. And so we, well, the result has been twofold. In other words, the result of the emphasis on propositional knowledge has been twofold. On the one hand, there has been apparently a positive effect in society, which is the development of science, the development of technology, the massive expansion of human knowledge over the past few centuries, compared with the past. And most of us consider that to be good, although I think we are also simultaneously seeing negative effects of that as well. Now, there is the other side of it, which is, that people are being estranged from life and from reality, and it is causing all these crises, causing a mental crisis and causing a societal process. All right, so that's, I'm sorry, that was a very long explanation of.
No, it was a good explanation though.
I'm sorry, I don't know how long you want me to talk about each subject.
As long as you want to talk, I'm good with it.
Or in how much detail, because of course we can go into many levels of detail. So all right, there's propositional knowledge. We have to have propositional knowledge, as Christians and just as human beings, but it should not be the be all and end all of knowledge and our the way we understand ourselves in the world. So then there is another level of knowledge which can be called procedural, and what this is this refers to skills and abilities that we have that we use for our hopefully our positive experience in life. You know, when you know how to do something in practice, you are not thinking of it in propositional terms. You are simply doing it as what we could call a procedure. So, for example, if you are, well, I would use the example of singing because I like to sing in church. You know, in order to learn singing, there are propositions that you need to know. You know, you need to know the scale, and you need to learn what each. If you're going to read notes, you need to know what each symbol represents and what are the intervals between the notes and so on and so forth. But when you're actually singing, if you're doing it well, you're not thinking about the propositions of, you know, what is of course I'm using Byzantine music, so it's a different set of ideas from a lot of Western polyphonic music. You're thinking of it in practical terms, or you're not even thinking about it at all. It becomes instinctive, almost like what some people would call muscle memory. But nevertheless, it is a form of knowledge. You know, I know how to read but when I'm reading, I'm not thinking about the propositional fact that, you know, this symbol represents A and this symbol represents B. I am automatically putting them all together and extracting meaning or knowledge from it in a procedural way. So often, in order to have a procedural knowledge, it has to be preceded by some sort of propositional knowledge. In other words, you're going to learn that you need to do X, Y, and Z in order to have a certain result. But once you're doing it, it's procedural. It's not propositional anymore. And yet it is real knowledge. So in Christianity, or rather, let's say specifically in the church, the kinds of procedures that we have that are connected to our spiritual life, in which we believe help to connect us to reality on a more fundamental level, could be things like, well, I just mentioned music. So, you know, the music that we sing in church, you know, whichever it might be, there different churches use different types of music, but pretty much every church uses some sort of music. Or it might be in the Orthodox Church, we would have things like icons. So somebody has to paint the icons, and that is procedural knowledge, how to paint an icon, or any other skill that we would use in the context of the church. Now, unfortunately, Protestant churches tend to neglect this aspect of spiritual life. So, for example, they don't believe in icons or images. In the Orthodox Church and in the Roman Catholic Church, these are highly valued as part of our spiritual life. So different people, different people, of course, are going to have different let's say, procedures, if we want to use that word, or we could say different skills in order to, which are most, which make the most sense to them, because every person is different. And what is beautiful about the church is that we don't limit our, let's say, the means by which we express ourselves just to one thing. We approach it from many different angles, and maybe one angle appeals more to one person and another angle appeals more to another person. So for example, we have singing in church, right? We have iconography in church. We have, let's say, incense in church. We have ritual in church, there's processions, and there's kind of a choreography going on. You have often there's a kind of a dialogue going on between, say, the priest and the choir, or the priest and the people. Sometimes there's a dialogue between the priest and the deacon. We have reading that we do in church. These are all procedures. They're all kinds of procedural, what could be called procedural knowledge. Some of them appeal more to one person. Some of them appeal more to another person. Some people don't get anything out of, some particular practice of the church. And yet we let's say we mandate the existence of all of them, precisely because the church is intended to be for everyone. It's not just some little group. It's intended to be universal. So, that's what the word Catholic means. It means in Greek universal. So, and of course, we as the Orthodox Church, we consider ourselves also to be the Catholic Church in the root sense of the word. So these would be some examples of procedural within the specifically Christian context. Now, you could broaden that in order to talk about, let's say, life in general. Everybody, well, there's always some exception, but let's say everybody needs to have something to do, something practical to do in their life. That is not simply work in order to earn money, in order to pay your bills. Rather, something that you do that you find meaningful. It's going to be some sort of practice. Now, if it can align with your work that you use to make money, that's great. So much the better. Blessed are those people. For those people who can't make the two align, these practices or skills or abilities or procedures, end up being something like a hobby, or something they do in their free time or their spare time. So, it could be, the list is endless. It could be playing a guitar or playing the piano. It could be dancing. It could be some sport. It could be some craft, like, maybe like carpentry. It could be some form of art, sculpture or painting, or, it could be gardening, it could be baking or cooking, or sewing, or, the list is endless of different procedural, what we could call procedural knowledge or skills or abilities that connect us to the real world in a way that is productive or constructive, and which, because of that connection, provide a sense of meaning to us. Now, John Rebicki has an idea about this, which I agree with, which is that he calls it relevance realization. And what that means is that different people are in different situations and have different personalities, different characters, and we need to perceive or identify what practice or belief or approach is relevant to us in that particular situation. Now, the situation might be your whole life. So the idea here is that, so I'll just use my own person as an example. I like calligraphy. So for me, it is very meaningful, it is fulfilling, it is relevant to do some calligraphy. And usually I do that, in the form of journaling. Now, if I didn't do that, if I removed that part from my life would be worse. That I would feel to some extent, not completely, but to some extent, I would feel like some meaning had been removed from my life. Why? Because it is something that is connected to reality, and you can go through it and see how it's connected to reality. I mean, again, using the example of calligraphy, with calligraphy, well, first of all, it's something physical. Pen, paper, ink, right? Physical objects that God created, or at least created the materials out of which we formulated them. Then you're writing a letter. Well, a letter and then a word is a symbol of a sound, a symbol of a thought, a symbol of an idea that we have in the mind. So we are connecting that physical reality with what is in our mind, by means of the letters and words that I'm writing out. And then
Bishop
the act of...
Sorry to interrupt. Zoom is telling me we have a minute and a half left before it disconnects, because I have the free Zoom, the cheap Zoom.
Oh, okay.
But I'm happy to keep going if you want to keep going. Like, I could just send you the same link again, and then it would reactivate. But I've also taken up a lot of your time if you have to continue with your day.
Well, I didn't know how long we were going to talk, so I scheduled it so that I'm free.
Cool.
So we can keep talking. I mean, we haven't gotten too far on this.
No,
but that's because I tend to ramble.
Well, there's a lot of stuff that has to be set up definitionally too at the outset. So, but I'll disconnect then and I'll send you another link.
Sure.
Okay.
So again, and I want to back up a little and re-emphasize something in order to put all of this in the right context. My primary assertion here with regards to meaning is that we as human beings attain or acquire or participate or possess or have meaning in our lives to the extent that we are positively and constructively connected to reality and ultimately to the source of reality, which is God. And so that connection has to begin most obviously with the recognition that such reality does exist. And then it has to go to the specific ways in which we can connect to reality in a positive sense, because it's possible to do it in a negative sense as well. So when I'm speaking about these different practices or beliefs that the church has, or more broadly, practices, beliefs, experiences, skills, relations, and so forth, and in general life, we understand it as being based on this connection, trying to establish this connection between us and reality and us and God on as many different levels and as many different ways and as intensely and completely as possible. That is what creates meaning in our life. That is both the meaning of life and meaning in life. We can make it. Yes?
I had this question way later, but I feel like I should ask it now. And I guess we might have to go into the essence energies distinction. We might have to explain that, but I'll just ask the question. Is meaning and the presence of the energies of God the same thing in your view?
No.
Okay.
No. Not that there's no connection. There is a connection. I guess maybe on a couple different levels, but you don't need to bring in the essence energy distinction of God in order to begin this conversation.
Okay.
That would come in much later in the conversation.
Okay.
Now some people might find it relevant to them in that the distinction that we make in the Orthodox Church between the essence and the energies of God is connected with with our understanding of that how propositional knowledge ought not to be exaggerated, and how we need to experience God in a real way. And we believe that our experience of God in a real way is through the energies of God. That is the connection. So there's this emphasis in the Orthodox Church on the experiential and the participatory, and while we of course affirm the propositional, we believe that the Roman Catholic Church and the Protestant churches have over-exaggerated the propositional at the expense of the participatory, and that parts of the reason why that occurred was because of the identification in scholastic thinkers of the essence and the energy of God, thereby boxing themselves into a propositional framework and not giving proper scope for the participatory element, because that participatory element is through the energies of God, and they've taken that you can say the free energies of God that we can participate in, and they've boxed it into the essence. So that's where we would say that there was a mistake made in the West. And
can you expand on that a bit? What did the West do that makes it so that it's boxed in propositionally? Is it because? Well, sorry, I'll just let you answer that. What specifically is it that the essence energies distinction allows for or expands or whatever that makes it so that it's not propositionally boxed in?
Okay, so if we take what we can call the standard view within the West, and by the West here historically I mean the Roman Catholic Church, although it really this idea of the identification of the essence and the energy of God really started with St. Augustine. He didn't express it in quite those terms, but he expressed the meaning behind it. In other words, Augustine stated that all of the let's say the qualities or properties that we ascribe to God, justice, wisdom, mercy, compassion, love, so forth, which all Christians believe in, that God not only has those things, but is those things, and in the most fundamental sense, that these are identical to his essence. And so that idea of St. Augustine was taken up by later authors, and it was expressed in perhaps its most coherent or articulate form by Thomas Aquinas. Now, not to be fair, not everybody in the West had exactly the same view. For example, Duns Scotus had a slightly different view, where he claimed that there was what he called a formal distinction between the essence of God and his properties. Although what he meant by formal distinction and whether it's anything more than a nominal distinction, that's not very clear. But the predominant view was the view of Aquinas, that everything that can be said or thought about God is one identical reality, his essence. But in the East, the Eastern Fathers, they never thought that way. They always made a distinction between the essence of God, which they said is completely and absolutely beyond everything and ineffable and incomprehensible. A distinction between that essence beyond essence and the energies of God, by which we understand both what we would call the properties of God and by which we also understand to be grace. In other words, the means by which God interacts with the world and God interacts with us. So from the Eastern point of view, or what we could say the Eastern patristic point of view, if you identify all the qualities of God or the properties of God with his essence, then you are left with a conundrum. In other words, how do you interact with God if everything that is God is God's essence? That means either you are participating in God's essence, which ultimately is a form of pantheism, or, and this is what the option that was historically taken by the scholastics, or you don't directly participate in God himself. Rather, you participate in some sort of created intermediary between God, some sort of created effect or some sort of created effect within our own person. In other words, like an emotional effect or something. So you will see in many Roman Catholic writings the use of the word grace, and it is referring to something that is created, to some sort of either a created effect or a created intermediary. And while in the Orthodox Church, occasionally we will use the word grace like that. And you say, so that's not totally forbidden. We also understand grace in a larger, more amplified form, to be God himself, and that we insist on this distinction between God's essence and his energies, because we believe that we can truly participate in God himself, and that this participation occurs on the level of the energies, as we become, as the fathers say, we become by grace what God is by nature. And yet it is not pantheism. It's not pantheism because we are not becoming God's essence. We are not becoming God himself in his whatever is beyond all being, thought, imagination, experience, reality. And yet we participate in God himself through his energies, his uncreated energies, which are, insofar as we experience them, they are God's grace. So of course, that is an experience, and it is experience of God. It is the highest experience that we can have, because it is the experience of God, and who is, of course, the foundation and grounding and creator of reality. So the the scholastics box themselves into the propositional and sever themselves from the participatory by identifying the essence and the energies of God. So does that make sense?
They box themselves in the sense of you couldn't have a direct experience, a participatory.
It doesn't allow for a real participatory relationship with God. It's always, it's like you're never quite getting there.
Right. How do the Orthodox give a definition of what the energies are if they're not the essence?
Well, I mean, we don't use definitions as much as are found in the Roman Catholic Church, but broadly speaking, you could say this is a super simplification, but sometimes super simplifications can be a useful starting point. You can say God's essence is what God is. God's energies are what God does.
Okay. Now, do you think that there's or I guess, can you explain how there is a radical difference between that and the West's view of like a created grace? Or I don't know if that's the right way to say it, but do you know what I mean?
No, that's exactly the right way to say it.
Okay. Well, I guess that question doesn't even need to be asked, because basically you're saying that the Orthodox view is that you participate in the actions of God, but not the isness of God.
You participate in God insofar as God reaches down to you, but God's grace is something real. Now, I don't want to reify it. I don't want to turn it into a thing. It's not God's grace or God's energies are not something that is separate from God or distinct from God. It is simply God. But it's an experience that you have, and ultimately, what this means is that by definition, I can say not as a sectarian claim, but by definition, the whatever spiritual experience Orthodox saints or pious people are having of God is much greater than whatever spiritual experience pious Roman Catholic people are having. I say that, not simply because I believe that the Orthodox Church is, the true church and so forth, although I do believe that. But I'm saying that because by definition, each has defined what kind of experience they're having. And the Orthodox are saying, we are having a real experience of God himself. And the Roman Catholics are saying, we are having experience of created grace, of something created, another something lower. So the Roman Catholics have already defined themselves as having a lower experience.
Yeah, okay, I can understand where you're coming from. I guess, I don't know if this makes sense. My only question I have left with it, I suppose, would be, are these things describing the same event? Does that make sense?
No. I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
Like, is the created grace the same? I guess you would say it can't be because it's created, right?
It can't be. No, it's not. It's not the same thing. And the consequence of what I just said is that the spiritual experience of Orthodox people, as opposed to Roman Catholic people, at least on the higher levels, is going to be a different experience, and ultimately a higher experience. Now on the lower levels, it may be identical, For example, what we do use the word grace to refer to our, to religious emotions. So, for example, if you're in, you're in church, let's say, and you feel, you feel compunction or contrition, you feel repentance over your sins. Maybe you start weeping in church, or you feel intense love towards God, or thankfulness towards God. You feel this, a connection to God and the importance of His work of salvation for us, and so forth. These are emotions that we might have. Insofar as they are emotions, they are created. In other words, they are part of our human person. And you can argue back and forth. It's really irrelevant to this point. How much of that is chemicals and hormones and electrical impulses within the brain, and how much of it is something that's taking place within the human soul, which is immaterial, and what the precise relationship between the soul and the body and the emotions and so forth is. I don't have the answer to those questions. I don't know if anybody has the answer to those questions, but we as Christians would all agree that that both of those elements are going to be involved. But the fact is that both of them are created. In other words, obviously, any sort of hormones, chemicals, electrical impulses in your brain, these are part of physical matter, which is God's creation, and the human soul is also created by God. So it's all created. Now that doesn't mean it's bad. It's not bad at all. It's good. Obviously, God created the world, and He said it is good. So I'm not saying this to demean it in any way, or to demean religious experience. On the contrary, I'm saying that this is something beautiful and necessary and pleasing to God and essential to any person's spiritual life, to have these what we could call religious emotions. Now, obviously, you can go too far with getting into a hyper emotional state, and there's lots of delusion that can be involved in it. But the simple fact itself of needing emotions to be involved in a religious life, I think is hardly a debatable point. So and we do use the word grace to refer to, let's say, the advent of these religious emotions. People will say, I felt a lot of grace in that service. Orthodox people will say that. And I know that Roman Catholic people will say that. Or at least I've heard some Roman Catholic people saying that. I don't know how, exactly how common it is. Both, let's say, the Orthodox person and the Roman Catholic person who are saying this are referring to basically the same thing. And it is, they're using the word grace to refer to something created, and it is a correct use of the word, although ultimately it is a kind of extension of its primary use. Now, the problem is that the primary use of the word grace, in other words, to refer to the gift of God's uncreated energies which become part of us, that unfortunately is something which is not, not generally accepted or propagated in the Roman Catholic Church. So the point is that on the lower levels, it might be identical. The spiritual experience might be identical. But if you go up into the higher levels, it's not going to be identical at all.
Could you talk a bit about Christian solutions to the meaning crisis? Like, that's kind of what this whole thing had, this whole conversation.
Right.
But
well,
maybe particularly in light of theosis.
Well, the word theosis in Greek means deification or divinization. We understand it in the Orthodox Church to be the highest level of the spiritual life, or the most intense relationship with God, which naturally we are going to understand in the terms of God's uncreated energies. So the most, let's say, the classic expression of theosis that we find in Orthodox literature would be the vision of the uncreated light. And so we identify that the vision of the uncreated light with the light that Christ shone forth with on Mount Tabor at the Transfiguration. We believe that that was the uncreated light, and it is the same uncreated light, which is God himself, because it is God's energies, that holy people, not necessarily only saints, but obviously the holier you are, the more of God's grace you're going to receive. That this is that the vision of the uncreated light is a or the classic manifestation of theosis. Now, of course, in this life, a person is only going to have an experience like that, occasionally, and it's only going to last for a certain period of time. Although, when you are actually experiencing it, you're not experiencing so much the passage of time. But since that's the highest level of spiritual life, we can think of it as a goal, and it's useful to have a goal, but it can't be the starting point. So, we have to start out with more basic, practical ideas and practices. So, the first that I mentioned obviously is believe in God. Believe in the structure of reality, and that we are here for a purpose, that God has created us for a purpose, which is to be with him. And that to the extent that we participate in reality positively, that we are positively connected to it in as many ways and as most intensely as possible, that we increase our meaning in life. That we can do this first by these beliefs, and these are what we can call propositional beliefs. Secondly, we need to have procedures which connect us to reality, both in the strictly ecclesiastical sense, that means going to church, listening to the singing or doing the singing yourself, if that's your gift, or participating in the life of the church in some other practical way, whatever is most appropriate to you as a person. Then what we could call the perspectival aspect. In other words, how do we view life, and how do we view our moral life? How do we acquire virtue? How do we view events that happen? And there is a whole wealth of spiritual writings in the church, the fathers of the church that express, an ascetic theology, a monastic experience, all of the fathers of the writings of the fathers on the spiritual life, the extent to which they adapted or adopted ancient Greek philosophy or elements of ancient Greek philosophy into the life of the church. And then on a broader level, again, we can divide this up. There's the strictly ecclesiastical part. And then there's the broader, let's say, human part, which nevertheless, which there is a classical understanding of human life, which is correct, broadly speaking, correct. And that is what we can call the classical Western tradition, or you can call it classical education, classical philosophy, however you want to define it. It's this cluster of ideas and thoughts and and history and tradition, which is really necessary in order to have a correct perspectival understanding of who we are as people in this world. Now, but unfortunately, in our modern world, that classical education, we call it, has been attacked, and it's been replaced by all sorts of nonsensical and horrible ideologies. Postmodernism, everything is relative. No, we can't say the Western tradition is better than any other tradition. Instead of reading Shakespeare, we're going to read, Maya Angelou. Now, I don't have anything against Maya Angelou, but when there is a program with an agenda to erase the classics of Western thought and experience and replace it with elements which are, in a way, which are, not superior, often inferior, and often explicitly divorced from tradition, and used as a weapon against tradition in order to promote the idea of relativism. That agenda contributes to the meaning crisis because it breaks down the fundaments of our common belief system, as well as many of the specific elements of virtue. So obviously the virtue of chastity has been under the most terrible attack for decades now. On the participatory, on the perspectival level, we have basically these two parts that we need. The specifically Christian part, basically reading the fathers, let's say, and then the broader human part, which might be something like a classical education, and the acquirement of position. And then finally, we have the participatory element, which is, it can be, again, there's different levels. There's just participating in the life of the church, go to church on Sundays, and not just on Sundays, participate in other ways, be part of the community, have a community that you're active in, be connected, find people that are like-minded, that want to be good Christians and that share the same values as you, or at least close values. Try to live a Christian life and think of yourself as being connected with the whole history of Christian living, Christian saints. Try to practice the virtues. Try to avoid or crush the vices. To express love towards people, because love is perhaps the most intense form of participation, the most intense form of connection between people. And obviously then going from the specifically ecclesiastical sphere over to the broader human sphere, that would be family life. Having a family life, getting married, having children, having proper relations within the family. And of course, we would understand that to be the traditional Christian family, and not what we would call perversions of the traditional family, such as homosexual marriage or polygamy or anything of this nature. And then going back to the participatory in the strictly ecclesiastical sense of it, eventually, God willing, we're participating more and more in God through prayer and through the practice of the virtues. They're purifying ourselves. We come to perceive more the presence of God in our lives. And eventually we receive, if God allows, and to the extent that He deems us worthy, He grants us His grace. And then there's no end to how far one can advance in that. So in all of these aspects of connecting with reality, that we as Christians, regardless of whether we're Orthodox, Protestant, or Catholic, that we as Christians want to avail ourselves of, we can think of it in the both the strictly ecclesiastical sense and in the broader human sense. And there is a pretty clear path, with room for squabbling over the details, on both levels. On the propositional, we have dogma on the one hand, we have, philosophical statements about reality on the other hand. On the procedural, we have, singing, reading, chanting, choreography, iconography in the strictly ecclesiastical sense. And then in the broader human sense, we have skills, we have trades, we have art, we have, gardening, whatever, all sorts of procedures that help us to lead a fulfilling life and be connected with reality. On the participatory level, we have the strictly Christian aspect or ecclesiastical aspect of the, in the perspectival, I meant to say, of the, the writings of the fathers and their adaptation of ancient Greek philosophy. And then on the broader human level, we have, the classical education as a whole. And I mean that in the broadest sense. I don't want to exclude classics of that are outside of the Western canon. There's great wisdom to be found in classics of the East. I think it's useful for people to read the Diamond Sutra or the Tao Te Ching, or these books. And then in the participatory, we have the strictly ecclesiastical, which would be, Christian life and participation in the parish community and the advancement in grace and in prayer. And then in the, the broader human sense of love and family and human connection. So this is basically the path for having meaning in one's life, as specifically as a Christian, but also for everyone, to the extent that people believe and participate in everything that I just mentioned, they will increase their meaning in their lives. To the extent that they reject it, they will find themselves floating adrift and without meaning, without purpose, and falling into these problematic behaviors and thought patterns, and which end up with the collapse of the human psyche and ultimately the collapse of society, of a well-structured society.
Bishop Maximus, I feel like that's a good place to end it. I feel like you did a good job explaining the meaning crisis and potential solutions to it in a Christian context. You've given me a lot to think about, specifically with, not only with ways to better deal with the meaning crisis, but also the energies.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have much of a response to you. It seems like a pretty solid position to hold. So,
well, I'm not. Like you say, you're inviting me. My purpose is not to attack.
No, and I didn't really take it as an attack. And to be frank with you, I have been increasingly more interested in the Orthodox perspectives around it. Is part of why I asked the question. I just wanted to get your take on it.
So, but all right. Well, send me whatever you do with what we just did. Please send it to me.
Definitely.
And I wish you all the best, and God bless you in your work.
Thank you.
And well, you have my contact information. you ever want to ask me any questions, or if you ever want to talk again.
Definitely. Thank you so much. And thank you for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Well, you're very welcome. So, all right. Well, God bless you.
Thank you. You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.